Hello everybody, this is MonteCristo, and I said I'd do a vlog about the Sandbox Mode and Riot's announcement as to what they're working on today. So we're going to take a discussion on that and look at a lot of Riot's responses after the initial announcement that they are not, in fact, working on the Sandbox Mode, which is interesting. I personally disagree with that, but I do understand a lot of their reasoning behind it. And I think people are really getting caught up about some of these sandbox mode issues, and it kind of starts with a look at Riot as a company. Now, this is a company that has grown meteorically in the last 6 years since the release. They addressed that in their initial post, which I'll link below, and I'll link the initial post as well as the TwitLonger post from Quiff later, just in the comments down below the video that we will be discussing a little bit later on. So in the initial announcement, they addressed the fact that because of their meteoric growth, the fact that the game was originally designed for about 20,000 people and is now probably the biggest game on the planet, at least biggest PC game, and that has caused a lot of issues as the underlying infrastructure which they first developed the game with has a lot of tech debt right now, and that's obviously the case. I mean, we all know the issues with the client and with connectivity and all these other problems. I think what's important to understand here about Riot is that the magnitude of this game is so large that they inherently have to break a lot of new ground to cover and fix these issues, and they can't really rely on a lot of previous developers because no one has ever really had a game this big before. So you do have to cut them a lot of slack in that regard. I do think that it is still sort of unacceptable that we don't have a new client and that we don't have replays, but it's understandable to a certain degree because the infrastructure just wasn't developed properly in the first place. We're not talking about when Riot first existed, when they released the game. They had, I think, less than 100 employees. When I was there towards the end of beta, they had about 60 or 70. And from that time, they now have thousands. So it's not like Blizzard. We can't hold them to the same expectations, or Valve, that when they launched in their most recent games had a better engine or better stability for the client or more money and more time to develop these tools. And it's all had to be engineered on the fly since then. So there is some sympathy here. And we also have to consider when we discuss this topic, what is the priority for Riot? I think that clearly the first priority should be the client, just from their perspective. That's something that every single player uses. When we start talking about the sandbox and about the replay system, we're really talking about a very small percentage of the player base that is going to use these tools. Now, since I'm in eSports and I care very much about League of Legends eSports, they're very important tools to me, and they're probably very important tools to you if you're watching this video, because you're probably a hardcore fan with some investment in the competitive scene. And we just have to remember that when we discuss these, we have to ask what percentage of players are going to use these tools if they're released. And of course, every pro player, every pro team, every aspiring pro, every truly competitive player will love these features. But let's talk about who is actually competitive in this game, because we know from a lot of the data scraping sites like LoL King that actually in NA, less or about 20% of the user base actually plays ranked. That means most people, the overwhelming majority, do not play competitively in any sense. And we also know that even in highly competitive regions like Korea, we're only really talking about 40% or so of the player base that plays ranked. And of the player base that plays ranked, how many of these are actually truly going to go back and try and train their fundamentals? It's the same thing where we have a sport, let's say basketball. Some people play basketball a few times with their friends, or they'll play a pickup game here or there. Even smaller percentage will be looking to refine their skills through drills, dribbling drills or free throw drills, in order to seriously improve their fundamentals at the game to go pro. And of course, a very small percentage of people are professionals. So when we discuss Sandbox and we discuss replays, we're not really going to talk about replays in this one. That's a whole other can of worms, and it wasn't really addressed by a lot of the rioters in this particular instance. But we are going to discuss the Sandbox Mode. But that said, Sandbox Mode is something that I'm sure will be used by many, many, many people, but you really can't prioritize it if you only have X number of engineers at Riot or whatever that can work on these big projects. So with that out of the way, I'm not a developer. I don't know how hard making a sandbox mode would be. But to start off this conversation, we have to ask, does a sandbox mode already exist? And the answer to that question is it must. We know it does because we see it in the champion spotlights when they're setting up how to play new champions. We see instances where they're minions standing still, and just logically Riot must have something like that to balance the game, to design new champions, to test things, because they themselves need that sandbox mode to develop the game. So we know it exists. What state is it in? Is it polished enough to release to the public? Probably not. How hard would it be to get it there? I don't know. But we know it already is a thing that exists at Riot in some form or another. So I don't know how much work it would take to get it there to public consumption, but that's obviously one of the issues at hand. It's probably simpler than developing an entirely new client. I would say definitely simpler given all the major problems with that. So I'd like to see some more Riot information about that, how hard they think it would actually be, while they're telling us that it's currently off the table alongside the replay system and it's very low on their priority list. But beyond that, it's hard to say. So talking about sandbox modes, because there are many other games that have them, or custom map builders like StarCraft 2, and these games, Counter-Strike, StarCraft 2, Dota, these are all games where the sandbox mode is very important. So let's discuss why sandbox mode is critical. So sandbox mode for a professional player means that you can drill things on, like flash on zero cooldown, where to flash over walls. You can recreate certain scenarios, such as I am playing a level 9 Ahri with these items. I can put a level 6 Annie with these items in the game. I then can reproduce a scenario where I know how much it takes to kill said Annie. Obviously, you could map that out in terms of mathematics too, but that's really inefficient and doesn't give you a feel for the game or a feel for landing your skill shots, even though it's probably an isolated, unmoving target. Or trying to figure out where the hitboxes on champions are. There are basically an infinite number of uses for this, for drilling as a professional player or as a player who wants to get better. So I can tell you from being in the professional scene, well, how do players do this already? Well, they use bot games a lot of the time. If you want to practice CSing, that's a good way to warm up, especially if you are going into a competitive match. Go ahead, warm up with some CSing in the laning phase without much combat or pushback from the enemy bots. You can get a feel for your mechanics, try out combos over and over again without having to worry about other players. Important if you're practicing, say, Riven animation canceling or something along those lines. It's vitally important to teams' ability to practice the game, and they currently do this in the bot mode, but it's not as efficient because we can't control all of the parameters. So that's why sandbox mode is important. It's just like the difference between, well, I can only practice basketball if there are 10 people on the court, and there's no way for me to improve my three-pointers or anything like that. It's absolutely ludicrous because you have to have both of these things together to maximize your skill at the sport. Okay? So that is kind of where we're coming from this. So it's really, really important that this exists for the pro scene. If we want to see the best possible players and the best possible League of Legends, which I do and I have a vested interest in, but as an esports personality and as an esports viewer, I am in the minority of League of Legends players. This is just factual. So let's start taking a look at the initial announcement. I will link the initial announcement below, but I'm going to pull up part of it on the screen right here so we can talk about it, because this is what got people really mad. and myself included. Now, there were more reasonable responses down the line, but those highlight weird issues from Riot in other regards. So let's take a look at number 1 about the sandbox mode. This is what they said. We've heard a number of player requests for a sandbox mode with 2 main reasons. The first is trying out new content, which is something we value too. We want players to know what they're getting and to be happy with the things they're unlocking. The second is that players want to practice very specific skills without the constraints of a regular game. For this point, our stance is that sandbox mode is not the way to go. No, that it is the way to go, definitively. If you want to practice very specific skills, sandbox mode is the perfect tool. That is just false. We want to make sure we're clear. Playing games of League of Legends should be the unequivocal best way for a player to improve. While there are very real skills one can develop in a hyperbolic time chamber, okay, so you admit that you can increase skills in this way, okay, we never want that to be an expectation added onto an already high barrier to entry. On an individual level, we know this isn't always true. Some just want a space to practice flashing over walls without having to wait at least 3.6 minutes in between, but when that benefit is weighed against the risk of sandbox mode grinding becoming an expectation, we just can't accept the trade-off. We never want to see a day when a player wants to improve at League and their first obligation is to hop into a sandbox. We do want to support your ability to grow in mastery, and there may be other avenues to do so, but not this. I mean, this is what got the pro players and me mad. It's ridiculous. It is just frankly ridiculous. Okay, you don't want sandbox grinding to be that one thing. You want playing the game of League of Legends to increase your skill. Well, there's the fastest way to not fuck up your flash when you're playing a game of ranked solo queue is to have practiced that ability. I might have to play 100 games of League of Legends to get adequate practice to flash over a specific wall. But I can do that in an hour if I can just get into sandbox mode. So basically, it is much more efficient for players to learn in this manner, and that is just undebatable by any means. And saying something like this is like the NBA saying, well, the only way you can actually practice is for you to be in a 5-on-5 game and, well, just practicing by yourself, well, that's right out. This is a choice that players make in this game, just like everybody makes when they play any game heading into a sport. I can just play for fun. I can go there with 3 friends, play 3-on-3. I can do whatever the hell I want, and I can practice that way. But if I seriously want to get good, I should have the tools to be able to do that, and I think most players want this who are competitive. I can't imagine a player who doesn't want this, and I think the logic here is just entirely ridiculous. This is a statement that, I don't know how this doesn't seem very well thought through, and they actually backpedal on this really hard in subsequent comments, and they, in fact, pretty much counteract this statement right here. They pretty much counteract this with further statements down the road. And the problem with this is that we have a mixed definition. And I think this is where the confusion with Riot is coming from as to whether this is a casual game or whether this is a sport. And I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it can be both, just like any game that is a sport at a professional level. And we'll just see some more logic here in a minute. But I think it's very clear that this doesn't hold any water whatsoever and doesn't make sense, and in fact would contribute greatly to players not making as many mistakes in solo queue games, at least mechanical mistakes. And what they learn from the solo queue is the teamwork aspect, is more about which champions to pick, champion synergy, how they work together. Now, if we had a sandbox mode where multiple people could go in and we could practice, say, Alistair with the ball and Orianna ult combos, that'd be great too, and you could improve with your friends. So I don't even know what this is about. Now, my explanation about why they're working on Sandbox, they need engineers and developers to work on the client because everybody uses that, and we can agree that this is going to be a much, much smaller percentage of the player base using this mode, is probably fair to them as a company. But dictating how people get better at this game is an absurd stance for a developer to take, and saying that you don't get this because we want you to improve in a really inefficient manner, ludicrous. So let's go on to the next comment here. So this is a Reddit thread by Quiff, I think you say his name. This is a hard stance to take, but we do agree with what you're saying. That's pretty much why we opened with an agreement. Where it gets fuzzy, and he links to a comment, that if someone wants to improve free throws, they go practice free throws. Yes, in League, that means players should have an expected mode available where they can practice combos, flashing, etc. I'm not straw-manning this thing, but that's always been a core concern when it comes to dictating behavior. I'll explain. So now they're tying this into what is acceptable behavior in League of Legends for the players. In League, okay, hold on. An answer like players will see Sandbox Mode as an expectation rather than a fun tool sounds very we know better, but it's a pretty significant concern when you look at other games, i.e. fighting games, which have, of course, practice modes to practice combos and everything, where if a player wants to get involved, they need to hop into dozens of hours of training mode first. So in a game that's oriented around players trying to improve, imagine a world where you miss one flash over a wall and your whole team tells you to quit and hop into Sandbox Mode. Once again, I don't think it's an ironclad stance that will convince the world. I do think it's got merit. I'd imagine everyone's had games already where someone's told them to quit playing ranked and to go play normals. If an additional layer of sandbox got added underneath, that's what we're talking about. Okay, well, I think this is ridiculous because if somebody's going to be an asshole, they're going to be an asshole no matter what features are in this game. If somebody is going to be a jerk and tell you when you mess up your flash, now they could tell you, go play normals. They could call you a noob. They could tell you to go get cancer and die. They could tell you to uninstall the game. Now, all of those, do they really help you get better as a player? But, now we have something that I would like to call constructive toxicity, which is they tell you to go practice Flash in Sandbox Mode. Instead of going and crawling in a hole and dying like they might recommend otherwise, I now know, hey, maybe I should go practice that in Sandbox Mode. Wow, now I have a way to improve. And just like I don't have to take their advice about uninstalling the game, I also do not have to take their advice at going to play Sandbox Mode. That's like, in your basketball analogy, you're playing a game of basketball and you miss a free throw and some guy walks up to you and says, you should go practice your free throws instead of, why don't you go quit basketball forever and fuck off? Okay? I don't really see a problem with this. If they're going to say something to be an asshole, they're going to say it anyway. And at least now, there's a solution. I can have a solution. I can choose to take their advice. It's not even bad. It's good advice. Okay? So worrying about player toxicity seems pointless because if somebody's going to be a jerk on the internet, they're going to do it no matter what. They're going to say something. But at least if there's a sandbox mode, I feel that this is actually better toxicity, if that's possible, than what could be otherwise. So now we have, I think it's weird to even cite this in the first place as a possible reason because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we're going to unpack this further because it gets weirder. Okay. So here's Quiff again on Reddit. Take a drink of water. I'm going to push back on the concept of it being player toxicity. Sorry if it got represented like that. You just said that. Okay, well, whatever, all right. First, Banksy has a comment here I want to hop off. And Banksy's comment will be the next one that we look at. I think the concept of sandbox mode has a billion different meanings. Freeform practice, custom game modes, etc. So just clear that we're talking about a lot of things. To be clear, I assume he meant. The one that resonates the most is the concept of a free-form training mode for practicing abilities and techniques in isolation without the pressure of a game. That's what we're going to use as a shared definition. Okay. When we say we have a lot of debate, we mean it. Even in discussions today, we have lead designers saying there are aspects of sandbox mode that we could or should explore. I've talked a lot about the risks in various threads, but I want to emphasize it's not so much player toxicity as it is broad expectations. If the skill floor for fundamentals requires extensive time spent in sandbox mode, that's kind of scary. But for many, including designers, this is an acceptable risk for the potential gains, like pros being able to practice or players who want to get better having that option. It's choice versus no choice, as many of you have said. I want to accurately represent both sides and acknowledge them. The stance sounds fluffy-ish because it was born out of necessity to put the conversation to rest. As Banksy puts it, there are a lot of good reasons to explore training Sandbox Mode, and we're having conversations even from these comments and replies. But in terms of prioritization, it's still below our current ones. We are talking and we hear you. To do Sandbox Mode right will probably require a lot of investment. Probably a lesson for the future, then, for a nuanced topic like Sandbox Mode that seems more like a discussion than something on a dev blog. It's clear we sound super authoritative and hard-headed about this, so we'll adjust. I do think it's a conversation you could bring up as we still want this, but we also want to be clear it's not happening soon. In other words, an idea can be pretty good, but it can also not be a priority. There's definitely a better way to reach that conclusion because this one's pretty, painful. Okay. So, let's start with this. First off, I find it confusing that Riot says they're not doing Sandbox Mode, but they don't even seem to have a definition of what Sandbox Mode is. What I think most people understood it as was a mode in which you could set various items or gold or levels onto the map and play around with just things in Summoner's Rift. I don't think that means custom game modes. That's an entirely different subject. So I'm not sure why that definition is being tossed into Sandbox Mode. We don't have to have them all at the same time. We can have Sandbox Mode, and then later we can have custom games. That'd be great. But if you, in your initial announcement, you are unclear about what Sandbox Mode means, how can you even make an announcement about this topic? Because it seems like, with the references to the internal debate, the lack of definition up until this current time, the lack of definition of what Sandbox Mode is versus custom game mode in the initial post, it just seems like there's been a total communication breakdown within Riot itself. And when we talk about the rest of this comment, if the skill floor for fundamentals requires extensive time spent in Sandbox Mode, that's kind of scary. That's just life. When you have a competitive game, if you want to get better, you can just go and do that. It's not a requirement. Nobody has to play ranked. Nobody has to practice really hard to get out of Bronze 3. If you just want to stay bad and play for fun, that's a choice that you make every day when you do or do not play basketball, as our previous analogy has been holding up, because I use that one because that's the one that Riot has been responding to and many people have been using. So I don't really see how this is any different. You choose to be competitive in League of Legends. You choose to play co-op versus AI. You choose to play ranked. You choose to play normal. You choose to play ARAM. You choose to play any of the other custom game modes that Riot has released. So it's just another thing that people can choose to do. And I think that worrying about toxicity, which he just seemed very concerned about, but apparently says he wasn't. I don't know. I don't get it. I don't even think that should be brought into the equation here. I know Riot has a lot of smart people with PhDs on their player behavioral staff, or whatever it's called, and I'm sure they know a lot about how large communities interact, obviously much more than I do. They're experts in the field, and perhaps there's some validity to this that I simply don't understand. But from my perspective, I really think this is a minor issue. And I mean, how come these issues don't exist in other games that do have sandbox modes? We don't see I don't think we see a necessary uptick in toxic behavior in StarCraft, where you have custom maps, obviously different than sandbox mode. This is different, but custom maps that people made to increase your micro or accuracy of clicking, or in Dota. It just doesn't seem to make sense. And I do think the acceptable risk is there's almost no risk as far as I can tell. The gains are massive at the professional level and at the competitive level, and for players who really want to get good at this game. There's really no contest. It is in itself valuable. So let's look at the response that Banksy had, a different rioter that Quiff was referring to right there. So we'll just skip to below the quote. And to make it clear, we are not completely opposed to building systems to practice and improve at League. We think there is a real player value in some version of a training mode, especially when one considers that complex champions we introduced to League. Just as much as you, we understand League is a competitive game by design and, foremost, best enjoyed as player versus player. But for those who want to double down on their skills, League should provide avenues for them as well. Yes. The blog's intent was to peel back the curtain and give you transparency into the trade-offs we are making in development. We knew that some things we are and aren't doing wouldn't win us any popularity contests. But in my opinion, talking about this stuff is better than turning a deaf ear to players. Our explanation on Sandbox is weak, straight up. We made it sound like a binary decision, which it's not. The strength of the message or lack therein reflects the internal debate about how to best solve the problem for players. I think our product engineering and design teams are fully capable of solving this in an innovative way that players can use. The unpopular thing is that it is not on the currently an item in development, but based on this feedback, it may be that's what we need to adjust. So he's saying it's misworded, but it's not currently in development, basically, and it's not on the table. Okay, but basically you're just backpedaling and completely negating what you said in your original announcement, and I understand that you're trying to now react to this, but just because you say there's an internal debate, we have no way to know that at Riot as to what is going on, and perhaps you're just reacting to the bad PR that everybody gave you because your announcement said you weren't going to do that. I mean, just look at the phrasing here. Let's see. But for those of you who want to double down on their skills, League should provide an avenue for them as well. Okay, let's go back. While there are very real skills one can develop in a hyperbolic time chamber, we never want that to be an expectation added onto an already high barrier to entry. Okay? But when the benefit is weighed against the risk of sandbox mode grinding become an expectation, we just can't accept that trade-off. We never, strong word, never want to see a day when a player wants to improve at League and their first obligation is to hop into a sandbox. All they're saying here, so let's refresh what they're saying. They're mostly concerned from this initial post about the expectation. Now, the expectation we've kind of just blown out of the water already because I think it is constructive toxicity. That's the term I would use for it. So I don't really understand that the expectation aspect of it is really big. It's a human expectation that if you want to get good at something, you practice it. I think that everyone on this planet understands that is a true statement. If I want to improve, I practice. If I don't want to improve, and I just want to joke around and have fun with my friends, I don't try very hard. Okay? So I don't see how there's an expectation for practicing fundamentals in a sport if I want to get good at it. And this is where we're going to get the main breakdown in Riot's communication. And I think this is actually the fundamental flaw from everything that I've seen. So let's go to the final thing I'm going to look at here. So this is from a twit longer response from Quiff, which I will post down below. This is a small excerpt. It's very long. I'm not going to provide full context on it here. You can read it and decide on your own what you think. But let's take a look at this. I'm going to represent this view correctly. The concept of a training sandbox mode, something where players and teams can hop in to understand new champion abilities, in-game mechanics, or basic fundamental League skills like last hitting, flashing over walls, etc., is necessary for a game that adds so much additional complexity, team play, map movement, strategy, etc., on top of fundamental mechanical skills. Okay, this is in direct opposition to the initial announcement, where they said that they want League of Legends as a game, as in 5v5, to be the primary mode of learning. And they said that's how you should learn the game, and that's where you get all your skill from. and we're not going to release this because of the expectations that it would bring. This now says that that's where you should be learning the team play, which is what I said earlier, and you should have a different way to practice mechanics in an efficient, trainable manner. We agree now. Okay. Learning one mechanics in isolation of the other is extremely beneficial so you can fall back on it in the heat of the moment. Absolutely. That's why you train three-pointers, so that when you get the ball in your hands, you know through muscle memory how to shoot that shot. Value-wise, if League is on its way, if not already there, to becoming a marriage of sport and video game, then a training mode, the ability to practice fundamentals, is a logical thing to ask for, period. So he is addressing that he understands why people want this. So my theory is actually that Riot doesn't know internally, they have not decided whether this game is in fact a sport, where in a sport these things are definitely needed. Because on the one hand, they want to make the experience good for the casual player. And in the initial post we see they are concerned about the expectation that players will have of other players when it comes to mechanical ability, and making it more difficult and, I mean, for most people, more boring. It's a lot more fun to play a game on Summoner's Rift than it is to spend an hour flashing over a wall. I think most of us can appreciate that. So I can understand that perspective. But they are, at this point, Riot has to make a decision. This is the decision that has to be made. Do they want to minimize the sport aspect of it and say, no, the sandbox mode, if people use it, it will make the game less fun because there's going to be an expectation that people play sandbox mode? Or is it a sport where you have to do this to get good at the game? And we can just accept that some people, most people, are not going to do it. They can play their own games and do whatever the hell they want. Assholes are just going to be assholes no matter what. Just a truth of the world. And then call it a sport and say, this is what you have to do to get good at this game. Now, this is what every other esport does. Everyone, except for League of Legends, that is big right now, has an ability to train in an isolated environment like this. And I think, I am biased towards esports, that this is super important to have in the competitive scene. So, in the end, I think what's so weird about this whole thing is we have multiple people, multiple announcements, and I appreciate Riot's attempt at transparency. I think people saying that this is a money grab, that the fact that Riot can't monetize this is the reason they're not doing it, is ridiculous. That's never the impression that I've gotten from Riot from being around this company for, nearly 6 years now? I've never gotten the sense that Riot would deny a feature just because it doesn't make them an adequate amount of money. They really do care about the players in a lot of ways, which is why they're having this discussion in the first place. The problem is that right now, because it seems like Riot really has problems communicating internally, we end up with messes like this. It reminds me of that scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where Sir Robin encounters this three-headed knight in the forest, and the conversation, Sir Robin's standing there, just gets ambushed, ogre, three-headed knight, halt! You can't go any further. And he just wants to pass. And meanwhile, the heads are having a conversation like this. Let's kill him. No, let's be nice to him. Let's have tea. Then they have this ongoing debate, and at the end, they come to the conclusion that they should kill him and then have tea. And it seems like with all of these different statements being made publicly on Reddit, on social media, on Twitter, it's getting all crazy where no one at Riot actually knows what Sandbox is, or there's no common consensus on if it's even necessary. The only thing we know out of all of this is that it's not in development. That's it. That's the only new information we gained. Except we had many different people spouting many different opinions or logic or reasoning, and it's turned into this absolute nightmare. I think that what the community should do is put together a unified voice for the Sandbox Mode as defined by Quiff, not custom games, so that we can actually maybe see this in development at some point. Now, like I said, the takeaway here, you have to understand that if you're watching this video, or if you're me, you're probably super into competitive League of Legends. So it seems a lot more important to us, but it's definitely not that important to the main population on the servers for League of Legends, I don't think. And I think there are some valid concerns in here from Riot. It's just annoying that we get so many different heads talking to each other publicly, out loud, in front of us. We're just sitting there like, Sir Robin, what the fuck is going on right now? Well, this guy's, oh, we should do this. Oh, let's be nice to him. No, let's kill him. And then by the time the heads reach a decision, like Sir Robin, he just vanishes. He's not there anymore to actually hear what the conclusion of said multi-headed conversation is. And indeed, there is no conclusion yet. There's just a lot of saying, okay, we understand this. So I think what needs to happen is that Riot needs to, again, just decide, is this a sport? Is this a casual game? Because if they can decide that, then the conclusions are very logical and obvious. And either that expectation exists to, if you want to play the game at a high level, go into that sandbox mode and practice your mechanics. Maybe it's boring, but hell, a lot of practicing isn't fun. Or, no, we're not going to support this, and we're saying that this is fundamentally, first and foremost, a casual game that should not have expectations of boring practice. Now, I personally don't even think that binary exists, because it doesn't exist in other sports. You can play for fun, you can make a decision, and everybody already knows that as a human being, if you want to get good at something, you're going to have to practice, and a lot of the time it's not going to be super, super fun. I think we all understand that. I don't think Riot has to be worried about that or babying us in any capacity. All right, guys, that's about it. This video was sponsored by Alpha Draft. Thank you very much. If you want to go play some fantasy esports, just go click the link below and you can go do that. I have a lot of fun with it. Thanks a lot to Alpha Draft for the sponsorship. It's very nice.